Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we welcome you once again on this Wednesday evening to the airwaves of Salam Media. It is Wednesday night and it is in conversation with myself, Inayet Wadee. And once again, we bring you panel discussions on matters of interest. Now, in October last month, there was quite an interesting event that had taken place in Istanbul in Turkey, and we're talking about the Gaza Tribunal. Now, this obviously has been once again a groundbreaking initiative as well, and covered a whole host of issues. In fact, covered this Gaza genocide in its entirety, and looking at the speakers that were present, the panels of experts that were present as well. There were global statements of conscience that were made as well, and also diving into the crimes that had been committed, the testimony of the survivors of these genocides. There were witness eye testimonies as well, and the panelists and the whole host of experts that were present spoke on a number of topics. And when one talks about the crimes, from starvation to ecocide and also to domicide, the whole issue surrounding the medical systems, the journalists. So there was just so much that actually came out of this conference, and we found it absolutely important to actually get some of the panelists who were present at this event at the Gaza Tribunal to provide us with feedback on what actually came out. And I think more importantly, it is about resistance, it is about solidarity as well, but also, again, looking at the way forward where Gaza is at this point in time. And two of the people that were present at the event in Istanbul were Dr. Firoz Osman, who needs no introduction in South Africa, but he is a researcher at the Media Review Network, and also Prof Jeff Halper, no stranger to Salam Media as well, and the South African audience, director at Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. To both of you, Dr. Firoz Osman, Prof Jeff Halper, Assalamu alaikum, welcome, and we do appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Walaikum salam. Thank you.
Yes, Prof, in fact, now, Dr. Firoz, I'd like to begin with you because I know before you even left for Istanbul, you actually shared the Gaza Tribunal and what the event was going to be all about as well. And at that point in time, I said that we need to obviously provide some coverage on your return. And I saw, just from the program in itself and from some of the feedback that I've actually read about, very, very comprehensive in each and every way. So, just to begin with, just an intro, by way of an introduction, to provide an overview on the Gaza Tribunal, why it was necessary, and we can then go and delve into some of the detail.
Thank you very much. Yes, for me as a non-academic, as a non-legal person, I found this quite exhilarating, very interesting. It is like going to a court of justice. You have a panel of jurors, you have witnesses, you have prosecutors that are giving evidence, and we're all witnessing as to what has been going on. There were about 6 jurors, as far as I know, some of them, some journalists, law professors like Christine Chinkin, the professor Chandra Muzaffar, he's based in Malaysia from the International Movement for a Just World. Ghada Karmi, who's well known.
Yes, Doctor, I think we are having a slight problem. I know you mentioned to me you do have some internet problems, but I think just continue. We just lost you there for a second.
Okay. You had another one on the panel was Professor Samuel Arian. You've had him on your show before, and Venkowska, also a professor of political science. So they're very credible, ethical people that were jurors on the panel. And it reminded me a lot of the Russell Tribunal that we had way back in Cape Town, 2011, where they had a similar tribunal, mainly at that time talking about whether Israel was an apartheid state. And it came out quite clear it was. Interestingly, our own Judge Goldstone denied that Israel at that time was an apartheid state. So this is really a panel to discuss what the governments and the states are refusing to talk about is the genocide, and it is in Gaza, and it is to take place instead of the states by civil society, whereby they discuss issues that about the genocidal intent of Israel in Gaza, and to come to some kind of testimony that will indict those, hopefully, that are responsible for the genocide that is taking place in occupied Palestine.
Yes, Prof. Jeff, we are talking about the Gaza Tribunal, but interesting, when I looked at the program, and it talks about an introduction of the jury of conscience. And, 2 years after this genocide, and also after 70 odd years of the occupation of Palestine, we are talking about a jury of conscience, okay? And when one does comparison to obviously international law, for example, when one talks about the United Nations or the ICJ or the ICC, this jury of conscience obviously went into, I would say, a fair amount of detail, talking about, international law, talking about international relations, talking about a world order, the historical perspective as well. And let's just look at it from your perspective in terms of the need of a jury of this sort, because, when I look at some of the names that were present at this event in Istanbul, some of them obviously world-renowned figures as well, coming together, discussing, and for me, I think this is obviously groundbreaking in some way or the other.
Well, first of all, I was at the Russell Tribunal on Apartheid in Cape Town in 2011 that Dr. Firoz mentioned. So there's a long history of these kinds of tribunals. And I think the rationale behind them, and why we talk about a jury of conscience, is that, of course, they have no real legal authority. It's not an actual legal body that has the authority to hand down a verdict and to hold the guilty parties accountable. The problem really is that, after World War II, there was an attempt in the Bretton Woods agreements and internationally to try to bring the world to more of what's called a rule-based international order, where there would be international laws that that determine the conduct of war, that prevent genocides. We have the Genocide Convention coming on, that limit countries that are occupying other peoples. You have the Fourth Geneva Convention, for example. All kinds of covenants and conventions and agreements and treaties came into place at that time, including the International Criminal Court and the United Nations system, of course, itself. And a whole body of international law began to develop. And there's wonderful international laws. I mean, and they're very thought out. And there's an international consensus about them. The problem was, of course, that the powers that be, especially the United States and Europe, didn't really want to give up power over the world system. And so you get this tension between the international organizations that they created and the fact that they don't want to be dictated to by international organizations. So there's a built-in conflict. So what happens is you have this body of international law, you have the UN, you have the ICJ, you have the ICC, you have all these international bodies. You also have the concept of universal jurisdiction, which means that international law is supposed to be applied, internationally. This whole idea that, like Hitler used to say, The Jewish problem is an internal Jewish problem, internal German problem. Don't intervene. The world said no. Violations of human rights are violations of human rights. We're all humans. And therefore, we have to have a universal jurisdiction in which any country can hold guilty parties of other countries accountable for the crimes that they're doing. The problem then is that all that is in place, but there is no enforcement mechanism, because all international law and the enforcement of it has to go through the UN Security Council. And the UN Security Council, of course, has the veto. So now you have the United States and some of the major European countries and others, Russia and China and so on, that have a veto power. And of course, they exercise the veto power according to their own interests. And so there's a need. So then what happens is guilty parties are very seldom actually tried and held accountable. Smaller parties that don't matter so much, maybe Milosevic in Serbia, or Lawrence Taylor in Libya, where there really isn't a great international importance to those little countries, they get brought before the criminal courts. But of course, the leaders of Israel, or European leaders, or American leaders, because of Iraq and the terrible crimes they committed, they're never brought before international bodies. And even if they were, for example, the United States was brought before the International Criminal Court back in the 70s over their blockade of Nicaragua and found guilty and had to pay indemnities to Nicaragua. They ignored it completely. Remember George Bush, who said during the Iraq War, the United States and Israel, and we have to say China and some other countries as well, have never joined the International Criminal Court. And Bush said at that time that if the criminal court indicts American soldiers, the American army is going to invade the court. And here we just had a few months ago, the American government has sanctioned the justices of both the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and the Special Rapporteur on Palestine from the United Nations, Francesca Albanese. So in other words, that's why civil society has to intervene. The people have to say, we take these laws seriously. They're important laws. We have to hold these criminals accountable. And if the governments won't do it, as Dr. Firoz said, then we, the people, have to do it. So the jury of conscience was a well-qualified jury, academics and legal experts, but they were also, political personalities and cultural personalities to reflect the wider idea that this is the people. You see, one of the problems also with the International Criminal Court and its case about Israel and genocide, of course, first of all, it's very slow. It's been almost 2 years now. But beyond that, it's also, it's also very legalistic. It looks very much at what does the law say, and the lawyers are arguing. The idea of the Gaza Tribunal was you bring in wider ideas of justice. So even if the witnesses from Gaza, whose families were killed, or who are suffering from medical emergencies, and whose homes are, all the terrible things that are happening in Gaza, they would not get a voice in the International Criminal Court because they're not legalistic. They're not saying Israel violated Article A2 and Article 3, like that. And so the idea was to widen the discussion, include the political, include justice, and give voice to the people. So it was a people's tribunal to fill the gap between the international laws that do exist and the fact that they're not being enforced by the governments that have the power to enforce them.
Yes, Prof. In fact, Dr. Firoz, just to follow up from what Prof has actually alluded to, and I think this is extremely important because, when we're talking about the Gaza Tribunal, what politicians have failed, what governments have failed to do is what we see came out of the Gaza Tribunal and what was actually discussed at the event. When one looks at the global statements of conscience, and Prof Jeff speaks about academics, about lawyers, about prominent personalities right across the entire world. Some of the statements that were issued, some of the presentations that were actually made to delve into detail, because this was an event that was held over a few days. So when one looks at the level of detail that actually went into this tribunal, it is what governments, it is what even the United Nations, even multilateral organizations have actually failed to actually do, to discuss, and to go into the detail as to why and what had actually taken place, why it had taken place, and also the gravity of this genocide that has actually unfolded in Gaza.
Very true. I think, the discussion of the Gaza Tribunal, I think, started in Sarajevo. In November, they had, or pre-November last year, they had another tribunal that took place in London, and now again. And the wealth of information, the eyewitness of the horrendous genocide taking place has certainly been overwhelming. And I think this is the biggest advantage of this tribunal, in the sense that the evidence is factual, it is present, although I believe that the Gaza Tribunal doesn't have any enforcement ability. However, the information that is there will certainly help those who want to take action against the Zionists that are committing these crimes, that it will certainly provide that kind of factual evidence for that purposes. However, it was mentioned earlier, I think by Prof, that sometimes, and one wonders, okay, the Russell Tribunal, I think, took place 14 or 15, 2011, if I'm not mistaken. What has happened after that? And it simply adds to the moral weight of the accusations against the Zionist entity of Israel. At that time, it was said that it was apartheid. And in fact, our luminaries, such as Bishop Tutu and Ronnie Castells, have said it is worse than apartheid, despite the fact some judges disputed that fact. Now, I mean, there is no doubt in many international organizations, from Amnesty International to Oxfam to Amnesty International, that are saying quite categorically, this is a genocide that is taking place. And therefore, the Zionist entity has no place to go back to, and the evidence is clear, and it is made very clear what the Gaza Tribunal, in fact.
Yes, Prof, let's just go into some of the detail with regard to the tribunal. And I think I'd like to obviously start off with, initially when one looks at introducing as to why this is absolutely important and necessary. And it's always good to actually go back to the beginning. It's always good to go back to the root causes. And what featured very, very strongly and prominently from what I've read is the whole question surrounding Zionist settler colonization or colonialism. I think that featured very, very strongly. And I think, you featured in one of these discussions yourself as well, talking about crimes against Palestinian people, including or indicting Zionist settler colonialism as well. So that seems to be a very, very strong point, a very strong theme of the tribunal and some of the discussions that followed.
Oh, that's right. I mean, as you said, and Dr. Firoz said, the tribunal, very well presented and documented the crimes that were being committed. A whole list of crimes. A good part of one of the full days was simply talking in detail about the crimes, including the witnesses from Gaza that were the victims of those crimes. The scholasticide, the domicide, the massive destruction of homes, herbicide, the destruction of the cities, the medical, destroying the medical system, the killing of journalists. I mean, all these were very well laid out. But the point that I was trying to make was, while we have to, the genocide in Gaza is not simply a sum total of 10 or 15 or 20 different crimes. It is itself a crime. Genocide is a crime against humanity. Genocide is the ultimate crime. There's an international law, the Genocide Convention about genocide. Colonialism is a crime. There are international laws written down against colonialism, against apartheid, as you know. There's an international covenant against the crime of apartheid. It's called a crime in the title to the covenant. And there are also, of course, and then the 14th Geneva Convention, and there's crimes you can't, everything Israel is doing to destroy the infrastructure and the healthcare and everything. It's all found in international law. The point I was trying to make at the tribunal was, besides all the individual crimes, we should also be trying the whole system. The whole settler colonial system of Israel is illegal and unjust and unmoral. Mm-hmm. And so, not to lose, we have to get all the trees in the forest, but we also have to get the forest itself. We have to get that big picture. And what I was arguing was that we should be trying to indict as well the entire Israeli settler colonial system. It isn't that it can commit crimes, but it itself is okay. It itself is a crime. And I think that was the point that I was trying to make, to be sure that we keep, again, this bigger picture in focus. And in the end, the implications are maybe less legal, although you try to at least hold these criminals to account in public opinion, which means something when it's translated into government policies. But it's also important in terms of where these, the genocide and the apartheid and the colonialism of Israel over Palestine is going. And I think that when we're moving forward, we have, I think, the danger of the Abraham Accords facing us, the normalization of the whole Israeli settler colonial system. In the Trump plan that now Kazakhstan is joined in, and in these Abraham Accords, the idea is that Israel plus its settler enterprise are all normalized, all accepted. So, in other words, we have to be careful that we're not focused on the individual crimes, and that we're able to really mobilize against the entire system. We have to say, no, Israel itself is not legitimate. It isn't legitimate as a state because you can't legitimize a colonial movement. And then that leads you, well, then the question is, well, then what does that mean? And that leads you into a political discussion that is connected to international law. And that has to do with the fact, well, how do you decolonize Israel? How do you decolonize the settler colonial project? And then where does that lead? We've talked about this before. I'm a part of the One Democratic State campaign. I think it leads to one democratic state between the river and the sea. But in other words, these aren't only legal issues. These are issues that if you can get to the root source of the evil, which is the system of settler colonialism, then you could begin to deal with all the symptoms.
Yes, Prof. In fact, I think, Dr. Firoz, when we look at also what had been discussed at the tribunal, as Prof mentioned, an entire day was just spent talking about the crimes in itself. Now, for someone like yourself, what did it feel like actually just sitting through and going through and listening through all these crimes? And Prof Jeff listed the different types of crimes, whether we're talking about civilians, we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about medical, we're talking of journalists, we're talking about the scholarly fraternity, the students, all of them that have been impacted in more ways than one. An entire day just listening to the crimes that were committed. What went through your mind? What were some of your thoughts?
I recall Matt Gilbert was there, and he said something that really resonated with me when he said, you know, the psychological impact for the children and for the women who hear those bombs and see their families decimated. How do we help in that circumstances? Do we bring in psychologists? Do we bring in psychiatrists? And he said, you know, the fundamental issue is, as Prof mentioned, decolonization. Stop the occupation, remove them. That will start the healing process. And this is something that was new to me in the tribunals itself. You know, certain of these terms that they talk about, you know, domicide, where the deliberate destruction of homes and communities and the cultural continuity. I was wondering, why is it that they're bombing cemeteries and the archives and the, you know, that were housing the history of the Palestinians? Then, of course, they talked about ecocide. I mean, we are talking about 120,000, they took tons of bombs that is equivalent to 10 Hiroshimas in that small, tiny strip. How long will it take for them to recover from that? Then, of course, rapricide. Rapricide is, you know, that basically you're targeting the reproductive health. So as a medical doctor, you know, those that impacted on me. And of course, cholestericide, which is destruction of the education system and the journalists and so on. But there's one other thing that struck me quite hard is it's not only Zionist Israel that was targeted here. It was the complicity of other countries that were involved. Countries like the United States of America, or Britain, Germany, and some of the Gulf Arab sheikdoms, how they actually wanted the decimation of Hamas. And it is not only of Hamas, it is the Palestinian people, because they want the eradication and total elimination of the Palestinians. They want the land, and they you know, used Hamas as an excuse. And they are doing the same thing in the so-called West Bank at the moment. I mean, they're slowly but surely eradicating the population in the West Bank. And there's no Hamas there. They're doing the same thing in South Lebanon and the same thing that they've done in Syria. So there is something that's pernicious about this ideology of Zionism, that they want absolute control and domination of the entire region without the Palestinians being present. And this is what I came away with this crystallized thought in my mind, that Zionism is an ideology that wants control and domination of the entire region, and not only of the entire region, even as far as South Africa, of total world. They want domination, and they are supported by the Americans, the British, the French, and the Germans in this project, together with the Gulf sheikdoms.
Yes, and also I think, Prof, you know, you mentioned the name of the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese, and when she came to South Africa, in the interview that I had with Francesca, and she spoke about what Dr. Firoz speaks about, the international system and complicity. And we know Francesca obviously felt very, very strongly. She identified 1,000 organizations, corporates from right across the entire spectrum, from the military industrial complex to the banks to media to governments, corporate complicity that she spoke about. And I noticed that also, I mean, a special day was actually set aside at the tribunal, just talking about complicity, talking about the international system, talking about the resistance, and also, more importantly, solidarity as well. And here again, you speak a lot with regard to systems. So it's not only about a political system. There is a system that goes beyond the political system. There's a system that the media would promote. There's a system that governments would promote. There's a system that corporates would actually promote, which makes them all complicit.
I know, and I think tribunals like the Gaza Tribunal or the Russell Tribunal really reflect the powerlessness of the peoples of the world as against their governments. I mean, here the governments are the ones that set these rules. We, the people, did not draft the Geneva Conventions or the Convention Against Genocide. I mean, these were done by our governments. I mean, these are their rules. We're not forcing them into some foreign, dangerous, legal territory that endangers them. These are the rules that they made up, but they refuse to follow them because, of course, our governments are all transactional. This is the term that certainly we've all come to use. Trump is the epitome of that. And in this kind of valueless, system where human rights don't matter, the Palestinian people don't matter, interests are simply pursued. It's a win-lose, and it's who the powerful are the ones that decide. The Palestinians aren't even at the table. I mean, they have nothing to offer. They're not important geopolitically. They don't control any strategic territory. They have no oil. They have no major resources. They have no, they can't leverage the Soviet Union against the United States. I mean, they're almost the epitome in the world. I think maybe the people of Sudan are in the same situation, in which the only thing that the only resource they have or source of support they have is justice. That these are simply a people who are being deprived of their self-determination, of their identity, of their land. There's a process of trying to erase them not only from the land but from history, and they don't count. And in a way, I guess from that point of view, it's interesting. The Palestinian issue has become a global issue. And I think the reason, and there's been a lot of other, conflicts in the world that have not become as global, I think, since the days of apartheid. I mean, your struggle was the last, I think, real, and Vietnam before that became global struggles. But there's a million, in the Congo, for example, is terrible as well. Why Palestine? Why is Palestine taken this, in a sense, filled this vacuum that the apartheid struggle left? Because I think it has to do with pure justice. There aren't any intervening, that the Palestinians are on one side or the other, or they're doing something bad that somehow justifies what Israel is doing in defense or whatever. It's a case of pure justice and injustice, a people that is actually being destroyed before our eyes, with the complicity, as Dr. Firoz says, not only of Israel, but of our own governments. And from that point of view, it becomes an issue that if we lose this issue, it has tremendous implications. It leaves us all vulnerable in the world, all the people vulnerable to our governments, to corporations, to arms dealers. And I think if we can't protect the Palestinians, and if we're unable to really advance their rights and achieve some kind of justice for them, what does that mean for all the other peoples of the world that aren't as visible as the Palestinians are? And from that point of view, I think the Palestinians have an importance, a significance internationally for the peoples of the world, that explains why they've become emblematic of struggles of people all over the world.
Yes, Prof. And also, Dr. Firoz, what Gaza has done is obviously it has, to an extent, exposed what the current world order is like. And also preparing, I think, millions right across the entire world as to what a new world order should actually look like, because this is what Gaza has actually exposed. But also at the same time, it's exposed a lot in terms of not only complicity, but also hypocrisy. Because when one looks at the tribunal and when the tribunal speaks about the response of the international system, and we've seen how international bodies have come under attack, the disdain that has been shown against international bodies like UNRWA, or whether we're talking about the ICC, which is irrelevant and it doesn't matter, or the United Nations, the veto powers in the United Nations. All of this has actually been exposed. And I think this is absolutely important for us in terms of responding to this international system. We know Dr. Naledi Pandor had actually called also for a relook at the United Nations and how the United Nations actually operates as well. And this, for me, I think from a Gaza point of view as well, the hypocrisy of the international world order, for want of a better term.
Gaza has that, and you said it so clearly, as did Prof say it so eloquently. You know, I think it is this month in 1991 that the United Nations rescinded a resolution, I think it was 3379, that equated Zionism with racism, apartheid, and racial discrimination. They did that, and they were hoodwinked to say that now there will be a two-state solution and so on, but there was simply prolonging and removed from the United Nations. I think, you know, you hosted Francesco Albanese here, and look at the global reach of the Zionists, where they actually issued a warrant of arrest in South Africa for Albanese, you know, for hate speech. I mean, that absurdity and the arrogance of the powers that be, that they would want to actually do that in South Africa, I think was shocking in itself. But it has also exposed, as you correctly mentioned, not only the international laws, the United Nations and its impotence, the Western countries who talk about humanity, delivering humanitarian aid, about democracy, all that has been exposed as duplicitous. We see what is going on in Ukraine, and we in South Africa are facing the situation at the moment where some of the South Africans went to Ukraine to fight and now want to come back in violation of the South African law. And yet we in South Africa are waiting for those Jewish Zionists that went to go fight in Gaza. How long are we waiting for that for? And the NPA seems to be absolutely powerless and paralyzed. So the global reach of the Zionist movement, we need to be very, very aware of in South Africa, particularly our political parties that have visited and met with the, you know, Netanyahu and its President Herzog and said it's all hunky-dory there, even in the event of this genocide that is taking place. So we in South Africa need to be very aware of the global reach.
Yes, Doc. Prof, you know, I know we know that the tribunal, for example, and we've heard that, you know, there are no powers of enforcement, for one of a better term, in terms of enforcement. But so are the international bodies, because we've seen how impotent they are. We've seen the lack of enforcement from the ICC, from the ICJ, the veto powers in the United Nations Security Council, where the United States holds all the power as well. So there is absolutely no difference at this point in time, because what is lacking is enforcement. But how do you see a tribunal of this nature as an alternative to these international multilateral bodies and international organizations?
Well, that's a real question. Because what it does, of course, is it really reveals, like I said, our powerlessness. How, in fact, I mean, I've been the head for almost 30 years now of this Committee Against House Demolitions here in Israel, Palestine, you know, fighting Israel's massive demolitions of Palestinian homes, about 60,000 only in the West Bank and East Jerusalem since the occupation began. Another 300,000 now in Gaza around that since October 7th. And the real question that when I work with Palestinian organizations, international, civil society organizations, and so on. And of course, all of us, I think, feel a sense of helplessness because we have justice on our side. We know our business. We know international law. We know the crimes that are being committed. We're on the ground. We can document. Amnesty and Human Rights Watch document in infinite detail these kinds of violations all over the world. And yet we have no influence over our governments, not over political parties, not over our governments. And so I think, like I said, I think the Palestinians are significant because they signify the dilemma of injustice being done to a people, and we're helpless to prevent it. Israel, I think, is significant because it shows how the arrogance of power, how you can get away with crimes, how you can, in the light of day and with the most impunity, simply violate international law. And even when the International Court of Justice gives you 1, 2, 3, 4 preventive measures that you have to do to stop, you ignore it and get away with it. And so this is really, I think, the question before all of us in terms of all of our struggles is how do these villains get away with it? How do our governments get away with it? And why can't we as civil society prevent that? So I think it's also a challenge, the Palestinian issue, from the point of view that the entire world, the peoples of the world, are mobilized for the Palestinians, and yet we have very little impact on our governments. South Africa, in your struggle, is actually one reason why I think it's so significant is that you were able. I remember Reagan and Thatcher calling Mandela a terrorist. You were in some ways in a similar situation to the Palestinians, and you were able strategically to cause the collapse of the apartheid regime and go through this transition that Palestine has to do as well. So we could learn from you. We could learn from other successful struggles. But I have no answer to your question, really. We do our demonstrations around the world. We do our human rights activities. We do BDS. I'm on the ground resisting. We do an academic analysis, Gaza tribunals, all this sort of stuff. But it doesn't really, it isn't really changing the world. And I think I don't know if we need to organize better as civil society. Maybe we need new campaigns like what Dr. Firoz, alluded to, a campaign to reform the United Nations. Unless you have structural change, getting rid of the veto, or at least expanding the Security Council to a point where 2 or 3 countries have to veto and not just one. There's structural ways that we can deal with this. The problem is we just don't have the power of advocacy. We simply are unable to break through, these power differentials. And I think that really deserves a global discussion among all of us that are activists in the world about, how do we organize better? And I think the Palestinians are the issue today. That's sort of the test issue in that case.
Yes, but also, Prof, looking at the tribunal and the representation at the tribunal, global figures, world-renowned figures that have huge standing, that have huge following in the international community, and particularly with regard to the activist community or the solidarity community. And just to look at the tribunal and some of the outcomes from this tribunal in terms of enhancing the work of solidarity movements, of the activist community, adding value to the type of work that they're doing, and also at the same time, encouraging the solidarity and the activist community to take action, as Prof Jeff alluded to, in terms of some of the fundamental changes that are required at a global level. How do you see these outcomes? And again, as far as the solidarity community is concerned, benefiting from the outcomes and of the tribunal in terms of what was discussed, as for to effect and to make absolutely sure that pressure is being put on governments, on international bodies to effect these changes.
Was that for Prof or myself?
For yourself, and Prof can comment as well.
Inayet. You know, my thoughts are this, that South Africa demonstrated enormous courage to take this case to the ICJ. They're still under pressure. I mean, the fact that no representative from the United States came says a lot today to the G20 meeting. And it shows that South Africa is under a great deal of pressure. A document entitled the FDD, which I forwarded to you earlier, shows that any organization that is supporting the Palestinians in its resistance against the occupation, in its resistance against genocide, will be and come under scrutiny and under a great deal of pressure. I believe that I'm going to return to what Prof said at the very beginning, that is that we have to work for the dismantlement of Zionism in order to get progress. It has to be that. And each country needs to see where is the Zionist, where is the leverage, and break that down one by one. In other words, our action needs to turn into a more organized fashion. And, Palestine is representative of, I believe, all the oppressed people in the world. And if you think about the Western world, it's about 10 or 12% of the world, can I call it the white Christian world, that dominates the entire world. And I think, the Palestinians are the tip of the spear that must break down colonialism in all its way. I recall a statement by Alexandria Haig that Israel is the aircraft carrier for the Western world. And it was repeated by Biden to say that if there was no Israel today, we will have to invent Israel in order to be a rampart, a protection for the Western world. And that has to be broken down. And that's where the Palestinians are. They're working to break down this oppression, this genocide, but also the settler colonial entity that has gripped them so badly.
Yes, Prof, would you like to comment as well?
No, I think that's exactly true. I want to make a little nuanced revision on how Dr. Firoz presented Zionism. I think what you just said is more accurate than before. You a little bit presented Zionism as a force in and of itself, that Zionism has the desire to dominate the Middle East, that Zionism, and I think you're giving too much credit and too much power to Zionism. Zionism is not a very strong movement. It was never a strong movement, but it actually is representing what we're talking about. You have a small group of Jews in Eastern Europe that in a very strategic way learned how to manipulate the international system. They saw the strengths, they saw the weaknesses, they saw who potential allies, they saw interests that they could serve. And in fact, in Zionism from the very beginning until today, the strategy is to serve the hegemon, whoever it is. There's no ideology here. We're not pro-Western. We're pro ourselves. And now, who do we have to serve that's actually stronger than us in order to achieve our goals? And I think they did that they tried to do it with the Ottoman Sultan, that didn't work. They tried to do it with the German Kaiser, that didn't work, but it did work with Balfour and the British. And that's what legitimized Zionism. And then they did it with the French, after 1948. And now they're doing it with the Americans. But let's remember something. It's interesting. I wrote a book about this called War Against the People. that, Israel is the second, third, fourth, it depends on the year, arms supplier to China. I mean, China's been very, very quiet on this whole issue of Gaza and the Palestinians. Russia is a very important arms supplier to Russia. India loves Israel. Zionism and this murderous Hindu nationalism grew up together. So that Zionism is not a client state of the United States. If things change in the next few years, Israel could very quickly jump ship and align with China and forget the United States if it begins to decline. So I think we can't give too much credit to Zionism itself as being a strong movement, but we can learn from it from the point of view that it's actually a fairly limited, not very powerful movement of a small people that has strategically found the ways to move its cause forward. In particular, its niche, of course, is the military, the laboratory, the weapon systems and systems of population control that it's developed on the Palestinians over the last century, has given it that technological ability to create what I call technologies of repression. I mean, Israel does sell arms to China and Russia and the United States, but Israel also, and this is its strength, I think, in the Arab world, when we try to ask, why would the Sunni states want to join in on the Abraham Accords? Because Israel sells them surveillance technologies. Think of the Pegasus system and the spyware of Khashoggi in Istanbul. Israel sells them tactics of population control. It sells them, it trains their police. There's all kinds of military weaponry that Israel has adapted to police forces, AI facial recognition systems that it develops on the checkpoints in the West Bank. And so Israel has really, in a sense, in a very proactive way, taken whatever resources it can get in this oppression of the Palestinians, and has tried to apply it to the international system. What do these different countries need? From Equatorial Guinea, that needs suppression, to the United States that needs navigating systems for the F-35s, and it fills those roles, and that's why it has the influence it has, because it delivers. The Palestinians can't do that, and that brings us back then to the question about how strategically could the Palestinians, I don't know, line up with. I mean, for example, just one more sentence. There is no Palestinian political program. So they're not at the table only because they're powerless. They're not at the table because you don't hear the Palestinian voice. All the mobilization around the world is there. The peoples of the world are there for the Palestinians, but they need a voice that says, this is where we want you to go. This is the way out for us. We want one state, whatever the program is. And that's not forthcoming. I'm not saying this in criticism because of the repression. It's hard for Palestinians to do that. But again, without that, without being able to manipulate and work in the international system like that, the Palestinian cause by itself, the justice itself, is not enough to really, I think, move their cause forward.
Yes, in fact, Prof, I wish we had a lot more time as well. But I think just finally, Dr. Firoz, Prof spoke about Zionism. And I recall I actually got shot down a few years ago on another media house that I was involved with. And at that point in time, many years ago, the term Arab Zionist was actually coined. And we know Christian Zionism featuring very, very prominently as well. And once again, I think and I suppose, even, you mentioned the complicity of the Arab world. We see what is happening now in Sudan at this point in time, the UAE right at the forefront of this genocide that is unfolding in Sudan. And once again, the international world, the international order is silent, not holding, like in the case of Israel, not holding Israel accountable for the genocide in Gaza, not holding the UAE accountable for the genocide that is unfolding in Sudan as well. So when one talks about the tentacles of Zionism as Prof mentioned, it's a small movement, but its tentacles have actually spread into, now we can safely call it Christian Zionism, Arab Zionism, because the Palestinians, looking for their solution, and the people at the forefront in terms of blocking any solution for the people of Palestine. Once again, it has been proven that the Arab world has been grossly and complicit in a wholesale way.
Yeah, I agree. I think Prof is correct. It's not a very strong movement in that sense. If it stood alone, Palestinian resistance, then it very well could have been no Israel today. We know that the Western countries, led by the United States of America, supported it heavily, militarily, and it came through the Arab world as well, on land, over land as well, in supporting of Israel. So the resistance was very strong. But the Palestinian resistance also showed up in the Western world. Look at the youth that are rising. Let us not forget the Zohran Mamdani's phenomenon in the United States of America, where a lot of Jewish youngsters voted for him. And I attribute that a lot to the Gaza uprising as well, the resistance of Gaza. So it is important for us to look at, I think, the Zionist tentacles that is gripping our government in South Africa itself, the political parties. Where are they having the leverage and weaken them in South Africa? That requires us to turn around from action to organization, and bit by bit attack the Zionist grip on our country.
Well, Dr. Firoz and Prof Jeff Halper, we thank you. We do appreciate you taking time out. Time obviously has run out, but once again, it's always a pleasure having you on Salam Media as well, and for sharing what you have and being part of the panel discussion tonight right here on Salam Media. To both of you, all the best. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you much.
Thanks, Prof. Very much honored to be with you. Thank you. Thanks, Inayet.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of part one of tonight's edition of In Conversation with myself, Inayet Wadee, right here on Salam Media. Stay with us. We come back. We will be focusing on the plight of Dr. Afia Siddiqui, and we will be talking with the attorney who is representing Dr. Afia Siddiqui.